Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Wednesday seminar series. I'm Behruz Qamari Tabrizi. I'm the director of Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. It is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Shaul Bakhash for this conversation today. I have to say that I've been reading Professor Bakhash's work for many, many years, and I had never had the pleasure of meeting him in person, but now, we have this opportunity to meet virtually, and hopefully one of these days we can invite Professor Bakhash back to Princeton for an in-person conversation. Professor Bakhash is a specialist in the history of modern Iran. He's the author of The Reign of the Ayatollahs, Iran and the Islamic Revolution. And again, I have to say that, I believe the book came out in 1986. If I'm wrong, Professor Bakhash would correct me. And truly the very first book I read about the Iranian Revolution after I came to the United States. And it was such a pleasure to see that kind of bird's eye view of all the events that led to and then happened after the revolution. He's also author of The Politics of Oil and Revolution in Iran, Monarchy, Bureaucracy, and Reform under the Qajars. And most recently, the book that we are going to be discussing today, The Fall of Reza Shah, The Abdication, Exile, the Death of Modern Iran's founder. I wish I could claim that we are so careful in our programming that we scheduled this conversation on the 80th anniversary of the abdication of Reza Shah, but it just so happened that we are having this conversation on that day of 80th anniversary. I read in Iranian papers that there were a number of workshops and seminars in Iran discussing this important date in Iranian history. Professor Bakhash has written, as I said, a number of books, and he also is a regular contributor to New York Review of Books, Foreign Policy, Middle East Journal, and also many of you have seen his op-ed essays in the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and Boston Globe. He is a faculty professor emeritus of George Mason University in history. And as I said, he is very familiar with Princeton because he's been here as a visiting professor earlier in his career. Professor Bakhash also was a journalist in Iran, one of the editors and commentators of the important newspaper Kehan in Iran, in which this was before, obviously, the revolution and before he moved to the United States. He's also the recipient of prestigious fellowships from the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, Guggenheim, Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and the US Institute of Peace. Discussing the book is our own postdoctoral fellow, Naveed Mansoori, who is a political theorist with a PhD from the University of California in Los Angeles. Naveed is here at the center working on his book project, After Prophecy, Propaganda and the Politics of Truth in Contemporary Iran. And those of us who live in the United States would appreciate this book after living 4 years under Trump administration. and realizing the significance of politics of truth. Naveed is also the co-editor of Jadaliya's Iran page online, and he has published works in comparative Islamic studies and society in space. Before coming to Princeton and joining us at the Iran Center, Naveed was an ACLS Emerging Voices Fellow in the Religion, Race, Democracy Lab at the University of Virginia. Before I give the floor to, or the screen to Professor Bakhash, I would like also to thank our events coordinator, Becky Parmian, which these days is extremely busy organizing these seminars, and also our technical support provided by Pete Novak, and I need to acknowledge him. I think we are having some difficulty. We just lost Professor Bakhash's connection, and perhaps we can talk a little bit about the book until we fix the problem with Professor Bakhash, and start with Naveed's comments and his understanding of the book, and then we'll bring in Professor Bakhash once he is reconnected to our streams. Sorry, Naveed, that you know, I just realized that we lost Professor Bakhash's connection, and so let's start with you, Naveed, and see what your take is on this important book, and then we'll bring in Professor Bakhash after your comments. Naveed, sure. Go ahead.
Sure. So I too would like to thank Becky and Pete and Behruz and everyone who helped organize this talk, and to Behruz for inviting me to serve as discussant. And though he's not here, I would have wanted to extend a warm welcome and thank you to Professor Bakhash for joining us and providing us this opportunity to learn more about the fall of Reza Shah. So in my own writing, I have a boilerplate. It's simply, in 1941, the UK and the USSR forced Reza Shah to abdicate the throne. What Bakhash has done is he has provided us a rich and detailed elaboration of that boilerplate. He has excavated the archives of diplomatic correspondences, memoirs, and journals, and more to tell us the story of the deliberation and concessions that resulted in the Shah's departure from Iran, and likewise the deliberations and concessions concerning his exile, death, burial, and estate. The text opens with his achievements. So Bakhash writes, at the turn of the Iranian New Year in March 1941, Reza Shah could look back with some satisfaction at what he had already accomplished, nothing less than the transformation of his country. But Bakhash is incredibly and impressively even-handed in his assessment of Reza Shah. He acknowledges the Shah's neglect of agriculture and the conditions of peasants, his war against tribal chiefs through exile and execution, his assault on the clergy, and autocratic policies and practices, including the instrumentalization of parliament, restriction of elections, criminalization of labor unions, and censorship of the press. But the Shah, Bakhash also acknowledges, transformed the disorderly system of the Qajars through military, administrative, judicial, economic, and educational reforms, in addition to relatively progressive policies that afforded to women greater freedoms to partake in public life. Yet the Shah, in Bakhash's words, did not foresee the inexorable logic of war that would append all his plans and calculations. Though the Shah strove to retain Iran's wartime neutrality, the Shah was in a geopolitical and economic maelstrom. Germany was Iran's primary trading partner in 1940, and there was a significant German presence in Iran. Unbeknownst to the Shah, the UK and the USSR already had plans to occupy Iran once Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. Why did the British decide to force Reza Shah to abdicate? And this is one of the most interesting parts of the book. Bakhash frames his response around the British minister to Tehran, Reader Bullard's 180, from pressing the UK to maintain goodwill with the Shah to Bullard's eventual call for the Shah's removal. The UK was by and large focused on influence, the influence of German propaganda on public opinion, the enlistment of BBC to potentially sway public opinion in favor of the UK against Germany, the possibility of recruiting someone close to the Shah's hard-heartedness to British prodding, and an influential perception conceived by Bullard's press attaché Anne Lambton that Iranians would welcome a German or Soviet invasion of Iran as it would result in the removal of the unpopular leader. While after his 180, Bullard faced resistance from the Middle East staff of the Foreign Office and Winston Churchill himself, he eventually persuaded the UK to occupy Iran on grounds of popular resentment, the Shah's intransigence, and the UK's dire need for resources. Bakhash maintains this remarkable deftness in illuminating the complexity of deliberation in subsequent chapters and episodes in the saga, with the UK's brief flirtation with the possibility of installing Ahmad Shah of the defunct Qajars in lieu of the Crown Prince Mohammad Reza. I did not know about this. It's really fascinating, as well as deliberation over where to send him, culminating with his exile first in Mauritius, what Reza Shah described as a death in life, and finally, to the more preferable, to Reza Shah, Johannesburg. So it was notable to me as I was reading that Reza Shah, as was narrativized in this history, was as much a master of his own fate when the court in Tehran and the Foreign Office were deciding how, by what route, and to where to send his corpse and to bury it, as he was amidst the inexorable logic of war. Or to put it otherwise, Reza Shah was influenced by causes beyond him. He did not influence. And there's irony here for me. History was once told as the words and deeds of great men. What the king said and what the king did was what constituted an historical event, a moment when the world moved. The king was a privileged actor on the world stage. In the face of the pure flux of time, the king, or let us here say the sovereign, was the voluntary suspension of this involuntary movement. Where life is the mere presentation of the soul, the king, as its representation, was a death in life. But in Bakhash's account, even in biological death, Reza Shah's body is animated, it is moved. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur reflects upon a similar dynamic in the historian Fernand Braudel's The Mediterranean and the Mediterranean World in the Age of Philip II, exceptional for its location of biographical and cultural time in the millennia-long timeline, the longue durée of the sea. The death of Philip II in Braudel's narrative belongs to the history of events, though crucially, it also appears as a structural death. It is the death of the Mediterranean as the center of the world. When we look to the micro scale, we become attuned to the uncertainties individuals attempt to overcome. When we look to macro history, we are more likely to ask how they are moved. Structural critique is a method of denying the agency and individuality of historical actors. It's a method of imagining how and why a life is moved and what a life represents. The prime movers of the fall of Reza Shah are state officials, their motivations a result of the inexorable logic of war, their schemes to secure geopolitical power. My first question to Bakhash concerns what I noted above as a method, even an ethic, of denying agencies. One of the cornerstones of the UK's decision in 1941 was that Reza Shah had lost legitimacy. The UK was responding to transformations that had already begun with the late Qajar dynasty. Furthermore, after the abdication, the literary landscapes of Iran, specifically Tehran, saw the circulation of texts that conceived the age of the dictatorship as the death of Iran. There was an overwhelming question here. The age of the dictatorship was an act and a tragedy. What was the catastrophe? Was it the fall of Reza Shah, or was his fall but a moment in a catastrophe that exceeded him? So if we're to understand the abdication of the Shah, we need also to understand why the Shah lost legitimacy. Bakhash documents a question the Shah asked the minister Sajjadi in exile. How is it possible that I should not care for the people and not be at war throughout my reign with the demons of unemployment and ignorance? But the Shah is not an authority on diagnosing the crisis plaguing him. In several episodes, Bakhash depicts the Shah as an anxious man. The source of anxiety, this existential fear, was not contained to his own psychology. It was a symptom of crisis. It is worth mentioning that after 1951, when Sadiq Hidayat took his own life, the suicide of this literary figure, whose corpus mourned the death of Iran, posed a question irreducible to a clinical diagnosis. Hidayat too was plagued by this crisis, but what was the crisis to which Iranians and the British were responding to? In other words, where in this text, the monarch's agency is denied in the service of unveiling British and Iranian schemes, the causes are overdetermined. There are many of them. So how then do we account for how and why these actors were moved to act? That's my first question. When the Shah was in exile, family members and others, Bakhash writes, saw tears in his eyes. He walked a great deal in the gardens and paced along the hallways of the homes where he stayed and seemed frequently deep in thought. He grew dismissive of the trappings of royalty that surrounded him. Bring it down, he later said, seeing his picture on the wall in the office of the director of customs at Bandar Abbas. There's no need for my picture anymore. He waved away the honor guard present at his final departure. What is this all for? It's not at all necessary. The minister Sajjadi recalled, on that day, Reza Shah spoke to me as a friend. The fall of Reza Shah is not hagiography. It is the representation of a monarch who is denied the aura of monarchy. The Shah embodied a crisis with his unpopularity, or more specifically, his perceived arbitrariness as the representative of Iran. Aside from its epilogue, the fall of Reza Shah concludes by reflecting on his wealth and estate. In exile, the Shah had transferred his enormous wealth to his son Mohammad Reza, after which he was penniless. The text suggests that he and his family registered their fall, experienced it through the value form, through money, seeking to redeem themselves with moderate success in Johannesburg to live as if they were royalty. It was money in those final days that served as his and his family's measure to evaluate their worth despite it all. Yet how do we measure this man's worth? Us heirs of the age of revolutions are habituated to say no to kings, but with what method and towards what end? Ironically, Mohammad Reza Shah was demonized for expressing grandeur with wealth, notably after the notorious 2,500-year anniversary of the Persian Empire, where the soon-to-be deposed monarch dwelled in the liminal realm of analogy with the likeness of aura. That is to say, Mohammad Reza was not Cyrus, Darius, or Xerxes. He could only be like them. In the 1970s, the younger Pahlavi attained the status of the likeness of Iran's ills, captured by a litany of exchangeable pejoratives: fascist, dictator, torture, capitalist, imperialist, and so on. That litany bespeaks a widespread effort to represent the world by representing the king, to say no to this or that abstraction towards a concretely better Iran. In his epilogue, Bakhash performs that gesture in a measured way. The Shah, he maintains, failed to reinforce liberal democratic institutions while enforcing autocratic ones, and yet the Shah also succeeded in building a modern banking system, new industries, a judiciary system, a system of national education, and the idea that government should lead in encouraging trade, economic development, and industrialization. Bakhash describes the above as a mixed yet impressive record. But in the wake of the catastrophes that have transpired since Reza Shah's abdication, exile, and death, how might we move from measured analysis to a critique of the Shah as autocrat and reformer? How might we work through the contradiction between the Shah as both a pawn and a king, and the contradiction between the Shah as comic hero in institutional time and tragic anti-hero in the longue durée of catastrophe? Under what sign ought we bury this king? What is the legacy that as witnesses standing at present might inscribe upon his tomb, placed as it is in the graveyard of a history he shares with his own victims? To state it directly, how ought we represent him? Thank you. And Professor Bakhash, you came in late. I extended a warm welcome and thank you. And you missed the praise of the book. I just want to say that right after I read it, it was immediately incorporated into a chapter I'm writing. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Naveed. Indeed, we are living in strange times that we started the conversation about the book, first with the discussion of the book and then presentation of the book. So we lost connection with Professor Bakhash for a few minutes. And thank you, Naveed. These were such important questions, and we'll get to your questions now after we hear Professor Bakhash talk about the book, how it came into being, and of course, if you want to take this opportunity, Professor Bakhash, to respond to some of Naveed's comments, please feel free to do so. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Behruz, and thank you, Naveed, for this very full exposition. There have, of course, been many books and articles written about Reza Shah's reign, both his accomplishments and his shortcomings. My book focuses on relatively new ground, on the events that led in 1941 to his abdication and exile, on his journey into and his life in exile, first on the island of Mauritius and then in Johannesburg, and on his finances, both as king and in exile, and on the difficult settlement of his estate after his death. What does this book contribute that is new to studies of Reza Shah? Well, first, I sought to provide what I hope is a readable narrative account of a once powerful and commanding monarch during the years of his loss of power and powerlessness, his unhappy life far from the country to which he had devoted his career, and humiliating for him in exile that he was in the hands of the very great power, Great Britain, from whom and whose influence he sought to free his country. The often given reason for the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran in 1941 in World War II was, and of course in violation of Iranian neutrality, was the large German presence in Iran, in Iranian industry, in its railway system, in its communications networks, and in many government offices, and the threat that this posed to the Allied war effort. But I think my book shows that an additional, in fact, the decisive reason was that once Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in July 1941, the use of Iran's overland route from the Persian Gulf to the Soviet Union became crucial for the Allied war effort and to supply a Russia hard-pressed by Hitler's armies with all forms of assistance. And having occupied Iran, the Allies took control of Iranian communications, the road and rail network, and required, in fact, demanded the full cooperation of the Iranian government to facilitate the movement of goods from the southern ports through Iran to the Soviet Union. The British Foreign Office initially displayed no wish to unseat Reza Shah, even though the British ambassador in Iran, Sir Rita Bullard, urged the Foreign Office to consider deposing Reza Shah. The Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, and the Prime Minister himself, Winston Churchill, concurred that British interests remained with continuing to cooperate with Reza Shah. But I am able to show that Reza Shah's abdication was not, in the end, voluntary, that it was the British, with Soviet assistance, who engineered his abdication. And I also detail the crucial role played by Bullard and his then press attaché, Anne Lambton, in persuading the British Foreign Office to bring about Reza Shah's fall from the throne. Bullard, initially as ambassador, eager to strengthen Britain's ties with Reza Shah, in time grew disenchanted with the Iranian ruler due to his autocratic style of government and the prevailing poverty, and he grew skeptical of the usefulness of Britain's relations with Reza Shah himself. Above all, Bullard's view of Britain's relationship with Reza Shah was shaped by Lambton's belief that the majority of Iranians hated Reza Shah, that they tended to see Reza Shah as an instrument of Great Britain, and, and that this close association in the Iranian mind between an unpopular ruler and Britain was highly detrimental to British interests. In cable after cable, Bullard urged his government to distance itself from Reza Shah. And with the Anglo-Soviet invasion imminent and then a reality, Bullard went a step further, concluding that the retention of Reza Shah on the throne was detrimental to England's interests, and that he must be driven out. Eventually, he won over an initially skeptical Eden to his point of view. I detail in the book the steps Britain took to bring about Reza Shah's abdication. At Bullard's urging and providing materials supplied by Lambton, Eden authorized the BBC Persian language broadcasts to promote the idea of constitutionalism and accountable government in Iran, and to launch a direct, escalating, and devastating critique of Reza Shah's rule. Lambton, a person not given to hyperbole herself, later wrote, quote, that it was almost entirely due to the Persian broadcasts from London that the abdication happened. In addition, Bullard directly and indirectly suggested to the Iranian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister that even the succession of Reza Shah's eldest son, Mohammad Reza, was at risk if Reza Shah did not resign, turn over all his wealth to the state, and leave the country. Moreover, Eden knew with near certainty that Reza Shah, fearing the Russians would arrest him, would abdicate if the Allies entered the capital, which they had so far refrained from doing. Again, through Eden's efforts, in September, Russian and British troops marched into Tehran, and as they foresaw, Reza Shah abdicated and prepared to leave the country and go into exile. Having abdicated, Reza Shah was under the impression that he could choose his own place of exile. And the family decided on Argentina, of all places, as a suitable place for the exile. The British, however, had no intention of allowing Reza Shah to go to South America or any neutral country. They wanted him firmly in British hands somewhere in the British Empire. And after some searching, they chose the island of Mauritius. I devote chapters in the book to Reza Shah's life in exile and his always strained relationship with Britain in this period. In exile, Reza Shah was no longer a free man. The British, of course, determined his place of exile. They dictated the conditions of his exile and the freedom they were willing to allow him and his family. They censored his mail. They decided if he could receive visitors from abroad, including members of his own family from Iran. Members of his party needed British permission to leave Mauritius, permission that was granted only with difficulty. Understandably, the relationship between Reza Shah and his family and the British remained an unhappy one. By now, the fierce and formidable ruler, whose ferocious temper could leave his ministers quaking with fear, had grown decidedly less imperious. His country had been invaded and occupied. His beloved army had collapsed under British pressure, and perhaps to save the throne for his son, he had abdicated. Something in the man had broken. His daughters saw before them a stooped, suddenly aged man. He was no longer given to his fits of ferocious temper. For the first time in anyone's memory, he complained that he felt tired. For the first time, family members saw tears in his eyes. Mauritius, with its public gardens, its green spaces, its abundance of flowers and trees, and its mild climate, was hardly an unattractive place. Yet Reza Shah intensely disliked Mauritius. The wet, damp climate did not suit him. He yearned, he said, for the cool, bracing air of his mountainous homeland. He complained that he slept badly at night. Visibly despondent, he avoided contact with anyone outside his immediate family. When the governor of Mauritius, Sir Bede Clifford, asked him whether he was comfortable, whether all his needs were being met, Reza Shah replied, quote, "What shall I say? We are prisoners. We are used to the great open spaces and the mountains. To us, this existence is a sort of death in life." To underline he was a prisoner, and despite pleading by members of his family that he accompanied them on an outing, he refused. "I am a prisoner and must behave like a prisoner," he said. From the moment Reza Shah arrived in Mauritius, he pressed to go elsewhere, to Canada, to America, to South America, to Argentina. The British were not sympathetic. A move involved considerable cost and extensive arrangements in a time of war. However, there were other considerations. Governor Clifford was concerned lest Reza Shah grow despondent and his health deteriorate if he were kept in Mauritius against his will. The Shah in Tehran was pressing his father's case, and the Allies needed Mohammad Reza Shah's cooperation. The British finally relented and Reza Shah was allowed to resettle in Johannesburg. Here, the Shah felt more comfortable than he had felt in Mauritius. The climate suited him well and was closer to that of the Iranian uplands, which he loved. In Johannesburg, he ventured out often. He took his walks in the city itself, and there he was struck by the modern story buildings, the cleanliness of the streets, the orderliness of people getting on and off trains and going about their business. He was particularly struck by the large presence of women in public spaces, wearing, as he put it, men's clothing, and driving taxis and even trucks. He was surprised to learn that the grocer and the washerwoman who arrived at his house were driving their own cars. In Johannesburg, the isolation he had felt in Mauritius was relieved by his ability to receive visitors from Iran. He had a visit from a confidant of his son, the ruling Shah, with letters and greetings. His second eldest daughter, Princess Ashraf, came to spend 6 weeks with her father. Reza Shah, always hungry for news about the situation in Iran, eagerly read the letters and newspapers that she brought with her and besieged her with questions about Iran and his son. He continued the ritual he had begun in Mauritius of listening every evening to the Persian news broadcasts of the BBC, Berlin radio, and when it could be accessed, the news from Radio Tehran. It was in Johannesburg that in July 1954, Reza Shah, after a lengthy illness, passed away. I cover 3 additional subjects in the book, which I will touch on briefly here. It has been known, but only in a general and uncertain sort of way, that along with Reza Shah's abdication, the British briefly considered reinstating on the throne the little regretted Qajar dynasty, which Reza Shah had overthrown, and doing away with the Pahlavi dynasty altogether. I am able to show that the author of this quixotic idea was the Secretary of State for India, the very persistent Leo Amery. And I am able to fill out in much greater detail the British flirtation with regime change, and to show that it came much closer than previously believed to realization. I also show in the book that ironically, it was Bullard who had been instrumental in persuading the Foreign Office to force Reza Shah from the throne, and who had no love for the Pahlavis, who now helped preserve the crown for the Pahlavi family. In this, I think, he was importantly influenced by the highly respected Iranian Prime Minister, Muhammad Ali Furughi, and his Foreign Minister, Ali Sohaili. They advised against a dynastic change. There's also the matter of Reza Shah's finances in exile. At the time of his abdication, Reza Shah was a very wealthy man. As I describe in the book, during his reign, Reza Shah had assembled for himself vast land holdings comprising of, it is estimated, 2,000 villages or parts of villages, factories, hotels, and the equivalent of 9.8 million pounds at the 1941 exchange rate in his bank account. Under British pressure, he had, at abdication, transferred all this enormous wealth to his son to be used for the welfare of the people of Iran. He was in effect leaving Iran with no money of his own and with a party of 19 others, his wife, sons, daughters, sons-in-law, his private secretary, and other attendants. "I haven't a penny to my name," he said. "Where am I to go with this hoard?" During his exile, therefore, Reza Shah relied on regular transfers of funds from his son. And while at the time of his death, he still had 110,000 pounds in his bank account at Barclays Bank as a result of these transfers, it is quite interesting that during his exile, he always worried that he would not have enough money to support this hoard, as he put it, that had accompanied him, and insisted on making small savings. Finally, in the book, there was the matter of the settlement of Reza Shah's estate after he passed away, a story that, as far as I know, has not been told before, and which I detail in a concluding chapter. In brief, Reza Shah's estate, at his death, the money in his bank, in addition to valuables, or anything of value, I should say, was assessed at just under 130,000 pounds. According to South African law, the death duties or inheritance tax of 30.3% came to 43,000 pounds. Muhammad Reza Shah, Reza Shah's son and ruling Shah in Iran at the time, was adamantly opposed to paying these inheritance taxes, arguing that the money was his. He had transferred it to Reza Shah. But the South African tax authorities took the view that once transferred to Reza Shah, the money was Reza Shah's to do what he wished with it, and that the inheritance tax still applied. This resulted in a long dispute between the Shah and the South African government, which was only resolved through the intervention of the South African Prime Minister, Smoot, who decided in the interest of maintaining Britain's good relations with Iran, and as an act of grace, that the government itself would undertake this expense. Thank you very much. And we open the floor to questions, I think, now.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This is indeed a fascinating account. And as I was reading the book, the interesting question that came to mind repeatedly was this idea of paths not taken. And the way usually we sort of think about history is in sort of grand narrative terms, in terms of structural, institutional transformations. But then you open a window to the kind of micro levels of decision making and people on the ground and the way they assess the situation and how these assessments are transformed into particular policies. And in that sense, it gives the reader a very interesting and contingent notion of how history unfolds. And of course, this is a general tendency that, you know, the results of how history turned out appears to be inevitable, but then you look back at the different possibilities that existed at the time, and you bring those possibilities so nicely to life. And I thought that the other thought that came to mind was that again, this is the age of nation building, and it reminded me of the Italian unification and the way Reza Shah was a combination of Di Cavour and Garibaldi in one person. That in Italy they said that, you know, we have unified Italy. The time has come to create Italians, and this is such an interesting kind of way of looking at the contribution of Reza Shah, that the way he envisioned how to create Iranians through many different kinds of institutions of education, health, dress code, and so on and so forth, and language. But this is really an interesting treat for us that to see these kind of unfolding of the story rather than being concerned with the end results of it. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about examples like thinking about reinstating Qajar dynasty, and how serious was it? Was there any possibility in any way that that alternative could have become a reality?
Well, I think really it was entirely Leo Amery's fanciful idea. And the reason was there was a Qajar prince living in London who became a friend of his. And Amory decided that the Qajars would be much better friends for Britain than Reza Shah. And in a chapter I entitled Dear Anthony, Dear Leo, he sent personal notes to the Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, to which Eden replied again in his notes saying, Dear Anthony, pressing the case for a change in dynasty. Initially, both Eden and the Foreign Office were very skeptical that the idea was practical, let alone wise. But eventually, Eden came around. Partly then, this was the result of Bullard's reporting and his considerable hostility towards Reza Shah. Partly, I think, it was after the occupation, Reza Shah's reluctance to totally break ties with Germany. Of course, they were broken, but still, I mean, Germany was Iran's most important trading partner, its most important source of industrial equipment, technological assistance, and the like. And clearly, it was reluctance to break completely, and this was, as it were, evident. That too contributed to the decision to replace him, perhaps with the Qajars. But in the end, as I say, ironically, it was Bullard who convinced the Foreign Office this would not be a good idea. And I cannot prove it, but it seems to me just from Bullard's reporting that it was the Prime Minister Fourouki and his foreign minister who persuaded him that this would not be a good idea, that in the interests of orderliness, maintaining the dynasty in power would be the wisest course. Bullard knew that the Qajars had no popularity in Iran. And also Fourouki's assurance that the young Shah, Reza Shah's son, Mohammad Reza, would institute reforms and be a less autocratic monarch.
Very good. Yeah. There is a question here that it relates to question of political sovereignty, and I think this is also a general kind of question for nations and countries who were a part of the sphere of influence of colonial powers without being directly colonized. In a certain way, those places that were directly colonized, the question of sovereignty was a very sort of straightforward, explicit question. For places like Iran, which were the part of the sphere of influence of colonial power, the question of sovereignty was introduced at many different layers, and it comes back to this history with the Iranian Revolution and post-revolution and relations with the British. How can we is it possible to think about one of the key issues in the long 20th century of Iran, that the political question of political sovereignty remains one of the key aspects of imagining and envisioning and thinking about Iran as a nation state?
Well, as is well known, in the 19th century and well into the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the influence of both Russia and Britain in Iran was extensive. Mm-hmm. And they interfered in the running of the Iranian government in all sorts of ways. Mm-hmm. The Anglo-Iranian agreement of 1919, which would have appointed British advisors to all the principal government departments, was seen by Iranians as really a kind of Iranian surrender to the British. And it was an agreement negotiated by Qajar officials and agreed to by a Qajar ruler, Ahmad Shah. So really, yes, I mean, Reza Shah, when he came to power, one of his principal goals and accomplishments, we should say, was to free Iran from foreign tutelage and interference. And in that, he largely succeeded, I would say, until the war in 1941, when, ironically, it was once again the British who removed him from power and played a role in the succession of his son. But of course, I mean, Reza Shah, in terms of nation building, played a huge role in Iran, as you have just suggested, in creating proper ministries, a proper budget, collecting taxes, instituting a nationwide educational system, creating Iran's first universities, starting the process of liberating women. So both, nation building and freeing Iran from foreign domination were among Reza Shah's, I think, important accomplishments. Unfortunately, he also became an autocrat and brooked no criticism or interference, allowed no political parties, allowed no free press, and that contributed perhaps to his unpopularity in Iran towards the end of his reign.
Very good. I want to go back to Naveed to see if, because we have a couple of minutes left, again, I'm so sorry that we have to reverse the order of things today because of the technical difficulty. But Naveed, if you want to add something before we end, comment or question, then go ahead.
Sure. I would pose my the second question I asked again, which was that that Reza Shah is contradictory in many ways. The way I posed it in the question was that at once he's a pawn and at once he's a king, and another is that he is both an autocrat and a reformer. And there's a way in the text that the text's virtue is in not being so ideological as to ignore or obscure one of those aspects, to hold them both together. But I kind of, as I was wondering, was faced the question of like, how do we work through this contradiction? And especially in light of the, as you know, as an autocrat, like it's to me, and maybe this is my sensibilities, I focus on the autocratic part, you know, so if I'm making an evaluation of, for example, the British Empire and India, I'm not, you know, it's like, well, they laid roads, they built hospitals, they built schools, but oh, they also committed atrocities. So holding these two together, not ignoring one, but also thinking through the contradiction. And I was wondering how you're working through this contradiction of the Shah as both an autocrat and a reformer. It also provided the sort of difficulty of both saying that in a way he's not accountable, he's not responsible because he's just compelled by the exigencies of circumstance, but without absolving him of responsibility for these things that he did, which you acknowledge in the text.
This is one of those questions that requires a whole different seminar to discuss, and I'm sure you know, really this is one of the key questions that many historians are engaged with today in Iran and abroad, and this might not be done. We have only 1 minute left, and I don't want to put Professor
Bakhash and 140 characters or less.
No, that one Zen word that you know, reveals all the truth, you know. But let's end with that question, if I may, and hopefully we can invite Professor Bakhash in person to Princeton and have a good conversation around that question, which has become actually a central question inside the country. And as you know, there's so much interest now in sort of situating Reza Shah in its historical place today in Iran, and hopefully we can continue that conversation in near future. And let me again thank you, Naveed, for your thoughtful comments, and Professor Bakhash for writing this book, which I highly recommend. It's such a pleasure to read the book, as you mentioned, Shaul, that this is sort of a very accessible narrative, and people can really see the nuances of the last years of Reza Shah's life in a new light. And let me again thank you for writing the book and giving us this opportunity to have this conversation with you today. And on that note, again, thank you so much. Hopefully we see you in person sometime soon.
Thank you, Behrooz, and thank you, Naveed. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.